Hi, good afternoon or good evening, everybody. So, welcome back to Doc Talk, the 7:30 Monday evening presentation. So, this week I decided that I was going to talk about irritable bowel syndrome. So, I've been doing some presentations on diabetes, and we'll get back to that with one of the upcoming presentations. So, tonight it's all about the guts. So, irritable bowel syndrome is basically a disease that affects a lot of people. They say in the United States about 10 to 20%, depending on which reference you use, of adults are affected by this. And it accounts for about 4 million clinic visits a year. Now, this is something that not generally understood as to what exactly is the underlying cause. However, very, very frequently, this is triggered by an intestinal infection. So if you ever get a chance to check out one of my favorite resources, Dr. Greger's nutritionfacts.org, you'll find quite a few presentations on gut flora, food poisoning, and the many and assorted ways in which our foods are contaminated with bacteria that can make us sick. Now, I want to say that the irritable bowel is also something that I've had some personal experience with as well, because in medical school, I think it was maybe second year, I was helping out one of my professors with a presentation. I was helping to bring the slide projector back. Now, this is not quite the dark days, but we did still have a slide projector for those rare occasions we needed to do some actual slides. And this is only, about 10, 12 years ago. At any rate, so after that presentation, I noticed that my professor had had a kind of a GI illness. And sure enough, in the next couple of days, I developed a very similar GI bug myself. So it's probably some virus or just something that struck. Now, within a few days of that, I noticed that foods such as dairy and cheese and milk really made me very gassy and bloated, and also that my bowel patterns had changed. And as it would turn out, it was the beginning of having the irritable bowel syndrome that basically I'm going to talk about tonight. And so, what are the symptoms of irritable bowel? Well, basically the main things are usually diarrhea, constipation, or alternating diarrhea and constipation. So a little one for a few weeks, and then it turns the other direction for a few weeks. And a few other symptoms that can go along with it, basically bloating, feeling as if you can't quite get everything out of the gut. So in other words, use the toilet, you go number 2, and it just can't quite feel as if you get quite everything out. That's called incomplete evacuation, in case you want the formal term for it. Nausea is very common along with this as well. Sometimes people have more upper GI symptoms, trouble swallowing, heartburn or acid reflux, and in addition, some other people have additional things associated with the irritable bowel syndrome. So in other words, the gut's kind of all up in arms, so to say, but also for the ladies, their menses might become more painful. They might develop more pain in the trigger points in the muscles, a condition called fibromyalgia, and there may be some association with either urinary problems or sexual pain or difficulties. So these are all additional symptoms that not everybody with the irritable bowel syndrome develops. However, they happen to be very common. Another thing that is very common with irritable bowel is anxiety, or what they call mood disorders. In other words, the either anxiety or depression kind of things going along with it. Many times people with anxiety don't necessarily always come in with anxiety complaints, but sometimes they hold it in their gut. Sometimes they'll hold it in their shoulders or so forth in the form of muscle tension. So these are just a few of the symptoms that are very, very common with irritable bowel. And I can also speak from some experience with this, is that sometimes what can happen is if somebody is feeling anxious about a particular situation, well, the gut can very quickly become affected, and sometimes it can cause gas, bloating, or a dumping phenomenon, and as well. And usually, the more intense the emotion, the stronger and the faster these symptoms may occur. And again, this doesn't happen for everybody, but it is very common. I did notice that in the week just prior to the holiday season, right before Christmas, I actually had quite a few people coming in with irritable bowel syndrome, more so than usual, most likely as a result of that holiday stress and just kind of taking its toll on the body. Now, another thing to keep in mind with the gut is the nervous system. And so this ties in with the anxiety aspect of it that is just very, very common, because basically we think about the nerves as, being up in the head, the brain, and all that sort of thing. Well, a lot of people don't realize that we also have gray matter down here in our guts as well. And in fact, the gut brain, as it's called, is actually quite a significant organ as well. It's connected to the upper brain by this beautiful long vagus nerve. Basically, it's a giant nerve that goes to a whole bunch of different areas of the body. It controls the heart rate, it regulates the breathing, and it has a very key role in digestion. And there's a lot of research in how there's actually kind of a two-way communication between the gut bacteria and the gut and how this all is doing, and the brain, which, just to go on another quick side note, is one of the reasons why when people are having anxiety, depression, and so forth, there's some new research in linking probiotics with people's moods and feeling better, which is pretty neat. And if I hadn't learned about all these other connections between the gut and the mind and the brain and all that physiology, you think, what on earth does gut bacteria or gut flora have to do with mood? And surprisingly enough, it actually, there's been some research that shows that doing good gut bacteria or probiotics and lots of fruits and veggies, which naturally contain some of the beneficial gut bacteria, definitely can have an impact on the mood in a short amount of time as well. Alrighty, so women are about twice as often affected as men with irritable bowel. And again, mentioned that the different kinds of things can exacerbate it. So stress, again, just a very common thing that can exacerbate it, as well as dietary choices. A lot of the people in the United States have kind of the standard American diet, which is rich in fats and sugars and processed foods and other things which, generally speaking, do not promote a good, healthy gut lining. As a matter of fact, one of the key things that can improve longevity and health is increasing the percentage of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, all of that in the diet. So going from 0 to more than 0, even increasing it by 10 to 20% can make a big, big difference on the health of that gut bacteria. So, some of the other things that can be helpful with treating irritable bowel syndrome is insoluble fiber. So I mentioned fruits and veggies and the like. Also, there's been some research on things like bran cereal, whole grains, and even for those who are sensitive to gluten, a partially hydrolyzed guar gum. I don't know as much about that as the others, but there seems to be something to having more fiber in the diet and its ability to help the gut to regulate itself. Partly probably because sometimes when people have the standard American diet, which is rich in cheeses and meats and other things that tend to slow down the system, well, the fibers, they tend to have a normalizing effect on the stools. So in other words, if the stool is loose, it tends to bulk up the stool a little bit. If the stool is hard and difficult to pass, like the constipation side, it has a tendency to shorten the amount of time that it has in the gut and basically make the stool larger and softer and easier to pass through the gut itself. Dr. Barnard, who's of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, a wonderful organization, a lot of good information at nutritionmd.org, basically has the elimination diet that I recommend the most often to my patients. Now, a great number of people in the United States are lactose intolerant without realizing it. Even though I mentioned that after that initial GI illness, I noticed a little trouble with dairy products immediately thereafter. It wasn't until I was maybe like 38, 39 that I actually realized that, yes, as a matter of fact, I had at some point along the way become lactose intolerant. And so it's very common when people get a GI bug. The most common, Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter. Names doesn't matter, but those are just some of the common things. And when they get that nausea and vomiting and loose stools and all of that, I usually recommend universally for all of those folks to get rid of dairy for at least a week or two. And that's also part of the irritable bowel elimination diet that I usually recommend to folks as well. Now, why is that? When somebody has a GI illness, everything is just kind of sloughing off and going through the system faster than usual most of the time, because a lot of times that nausea is associated with some diarrhea during a GI bug kind of thing. And we've learned in medical school that the place where the enzyme is that digests the lactose in milk actually sits at the very tips of those villi. So if you think about your intestines, it's kind of like a shag carpet. So basically you've got all these little shaggy, things, we call them villi, and they really maximize the ability of the gut to absorb food. So if it was just flat, there would not be a lot of surface area to absorb stuff. But if you got like a bunch of shag carpet stuff or villi in there, and then you just really made the amount of surface area much, much, much bigger and much easier for the gut to do all the absorption that it needs to do. But anyway, back to the enzyme that digests milk. Well, it's located at the very, very, very tips of these villi, these little finger-like, shag carpet-like projections in the intestine. And so when the food is going through very quickly, it has a tendency to kind of shear off the tips of those villi. And so even regular folk who still have some of that ability to digest the lactose very often become at least temporarily lactose intolerant during the episode and shortly thereafter until those villi kind of grow back to their full extent. So the most common things that trigger irritable bowel syndrome, at least as far as foods go, and per Dr. Barnard, is salicylates, amines, glutamate, and that's basically components, and those are very commonly found in milk and dairy products, eggs, and wheat. Now, not everybody that has trouble with wheat is gluten intolerant, but it's one of those easy things to rule out in the beginning. So the idea is that if somebody is suffering from irritable bowel syndrome, to do an elimination diet of getting rid of for at least a week or two all dairy products, all eggs, and all wheat, very strictly for that week or two. I will tell from personal experience that even if you have a little piece of cheese or sometimes some milk chocolate or anything that contains even a little bit of dairy products, the bloating, the gas, and the intestinal things, you might think, well, that's going to trouble you for like a day. But the trouble is that usually it actually causes irritability and trouble for at least a few days afterwards. So that's why it really takes at least a week to 10 days, roughly speaking, to give it a good college try to actually eliminate these three things. Now, also, very commonly, if people also take away beef or essentially hamburger cow products out of their diet, that also tends to improve the symptoms quite a bit, mostly because of the decrease in intestinal gas. Now, a couple of foods in particular, cheese and the red meat style of foods, and by extension some of the other meats as well, they really have a tendency to slow down the processing in the gut. So basically it takes longer for food in general to go from point A to point B. And basically when things are slowed down, well, the intestine absorbs more water out of it, and also if there's not a lot of fiber going in at the same time, the intestines have a much harder time squeezing those products through. Cheese basically has a morphine-like compound, and if anybody's had any pain medications like morphine, they know that one of the biggest side effects is indeed constipation. So those are a couple other reasons why cheese and meat products, especially the red meats, tend to be more helpful when eliminating out of the diet as well, and tends to decrease the amount of the intestinal gas. Also, probiotics. There's been some research on probiotics. Dr. Barnard in his website mentions 3 in particular: Lactobacillus planarium, Bifidobacterium breve, and Streptococcus faecium, and a few others in combination. And again, I'm going to be linking these references down below the presentation, so you can go to some of the sources where I'm drawing this material to read up on this. So don't worry about memorizing those names now. And those are very commonly found. I've got an example of this is just a garden variety probiotic supplement that I found from our local grocery store. Generally speaking, the best probiotics tend to be those that are in the refrigerated section, just because if you're dealing with live bacteria, it tends to preserve longer if it's in the refrigerator. One of the troubles with basically the supplement industry is, unfortunately, it's not very regulated in the United States. And so it's entirely possible that your bottle may have sat in a hot warehouse or something on its way from the manufacturer to the consumer, and thereby maybe killed off some of the bacteria. So you can check online. There's a few different kinds of ways to test whether the probiotic actually is still got some live bacteria in it. And that's another reason why I oftentimes recommend fresh fruits and vegetables as being very, very good sources of probiotics, as well as some varieties of home fermented foods. I found personally that the homemade soy yogurt, which I described in a previous video, has been very helpful for the gut. There's also, oops, forgot about the backwards thing. This is a Silk dairy-free soy milk yogurt that if you start with something like this and then use your own soy milk or almond milk or whatever you like to do, either buying it directly, which might be time easy because you just go to the store, pick it up, and boom, you get instant satisfaction. The other thing is that when you get it in one of these processed things, generally speaking, it's going to come with a few different things. Like this particular one has cane sugar, natural flavors, a little bit of cornstarch, and a little salt, and some other stuff that's in there because they're selling it to a broad audience that is used to things being a little sweet as well. You'll find if you ever make your own version that after 1 or 2 times around, you actually lose the sweetness of it, but also it's a lot more bubbly, it's a lot more, it's going to probably have a lot more live active cultures because basically when they're manufacturing the stuff, they don't really want to have, a big bulging, bubbling product, because when you have a lot of live bacteria going, you're going to get gas produced by those bacteria as well. So anyway, kind of a difference between the store-bought and the homemade is the homemade just has a tendency to be a little more strong as well. All right, so a couple of other things that are very helpful as well. There's been a lot of research now on peppermint oil capsules, more specifically enteric coated. Now, what does that mean? So basically, when you take peppermint oil, if you look down at some of the heartburn videos that I talked about, peppermint oil has a tendency to relax some of the smooth muscle that are in the gut lining. So there's all sorts of little muscles that control how quickly things are moving through the gut. There's a muscle that controls whether or not food goes back up the esophagus or acid goes back up and causes, that heartburn feeling. And peppermint, along with a few other things, has a tendency to loosen up the muscle that basically keeps stuff in the stomach and not allowing it to splash up. So sometimes when people have foods that are rich in peppermint oil, they might get a little acid reflux because the food is kind of going back up because the sphincter is kind of loosened. So that's why they say enteric coated, because if there's a little bit of a coating around the peppermint oil, it allows it to go into the stomach, survive the stomach acid digestion process, and then make it down into the lower intestine where where that coating goes away. And basically at that point, that loosening, that relaxing property of the peppermint oil has a chance to kind of kick in and helps a lot with the symptoms. Overall, the study showed that it helped about half of patients that took the peppermint oil capsules, and about 75% of children that took the peppermint oil were improved as well. And so, as Dr. Greger says in his, should be one of the mainline treatments for folks with irritable bowel syndrome. Now, peppermint oil is actually a fairly cheap thing you can find, and I've had a few patients that were able to find it in their regular old grocery stores in the section where they have the food additives, in other words, where you buy vanilla and spices and so forth, because usually sometimes people will use it for peppermint candies or to make frostings or other kinds of things that they would normally do with peppermint. So again, that's also a possibility. I've also had folks that were in alignment with some of these essential oil companies and there's a few very popular brand names, I won't mention them right off the bat here, but that they have basic formulations that are used to help with irritable bowel. And I've had some patients come back with some personal stories about how they were, personally improved by using some of these various formulations. So another thing that sometimes can help with irritable bowel syndrome is ginger. Now, this is one that actually has a little bit of a mixture in the reviews. So the report was that the ginger powder decreased the severity of the irritable bowel syndromes by about 25% and relieved the symptoms about half of the time. Now, if you check out Dr. Greger's presentation on this, basically that turned out to be about the same as placebo. And you might think, well, geez, why on earth would I do ginger powder if it's no better than placebo, which, by the way, just means like sugar pill or something like that. Well, it might be a little bit of that mind over matter where you take something, you expect it to work, and it gives you a little bit of relaxation, takes away some of the edge of that anxiety, and so therefore it works, regardless of whether there's an active ingredient or not in there. Or it might be that other things are involved. Certainly ginger is very commonly used for other things. For example, migraines can also be used to help with nausea as well. And so it's not surprising that it's a very commonly recommended spice to help soothe the gut as well. And so whether to use ginger or not for irritable bowel, of course, is a very personal decision, but it's one of those things where it can't hurt, and if it helps, my thought is pretty much the same as Dr. Greger on this one. Why not? All right, two other things that are kind of fun. There's been some suggestion of using red pepper or cayenne pepper, again in that enteric-coated capsule form, in order to bypass that stomach acid digestion and getting the cayenne or the red pepper down into the lower gut. And you might think, well, why on earth would you want to have hot pepper or cayenne pepper in the gut when you're already having so much gut issues. Well, basically, the cayenne pepper is something that can be used to kind of numb up the gut nerve endings. So again, we were talking about how the nerve endings that are down in this area sometimes get a little bit hypersensitive. Dr. Greger describes some research in which they basically had a mechanism for testing basically how much of a stretch can the gut wall endure before it's interpreted by the brain as being painful. And what they find is that a regular person can endure a certain amount before they start to feel discomfort, whereas the person with irritable bowel maybe can endure just a little bit of gas discomfort before they start to feel aches and pains and the like. And so the cayenne pepper or red pepper powder that's either in these capsule forms or taken by mouth for regular food can be helpful is because the cayenne pepper actually inhibits basically something called substance P. And so, again, it's another fancy word, but it's basically the name of the component that in some of these little tiny nerve endings that transmit pain from one section to another, basically the nerves secrete, so to say, that substance P, and when that substance P is in the tissues, it causes the pain sensation. Well, there's something in the cayenne that actually blocks that, and that something is also known as caspacin, which is why sometimes if you go to the grocery store or at the Walgreens or any of those local pharmacy types of things, you'll sometimes see a hot pepper cream or caspacin cream, and that's used to help with basically numbing up areas. A little personal story on the numbing effects of hot peppers. One of my nurses back at my last employment location, I kind of got a reputation, of course, for being involved with telling people about food, and she had grown these peppers, and I don't know what kind of pepper it is, so I just kind of call it like a Peruvian death pepper because it was so darn hot. Now that I think back, it probably was habaneros, now that I know a little bit more about peppers, but back in the day, I was just like, this is the hottest thing I've ever had occasion to eat. And this was back in the day before I learned about how oils are not very good for the body at all, so I had learned that if you have a hot pepper and you want to take the heat down just a little bit, you can basically cook it, and the heat of the cooking will basically turn down the heat of the pepper because I wanted to be able to eat this. And so I got a little of the oil or the olive oil that I had fried it in back at that time, or sauteed it more specifically, around my lips. And that pepper was so darn strong that I felt like I had a thick lip, you know, like when you go to the dentist and get numbed up and stuff. I felt like I had a kind of a thickened lip in that area because the numbing sensation was so very complete in that area, and so just chalk one up for science. But anywho, the idea is that the caspacin or the cayenne pepper or the hot pepper, basically the study showed that if you had a 1.5 teaspoon per day worked in the enteric-coated pills, it went down and it kind of numbed up those intestines, and it had a tendency to calm down the gas, the pain, the bloating, and the nausea that went along with it. One other tip with hot peppers is if it's something that burns up here, it may burn on the other end. So just something to keep in mind so that if you do try something along these lines that you're not surprised. Now finally, one last tip for irritable bowel, especially those with the constipation phase of this. There was a study that showed that 2 kiwi fruit a day. Now mind you, this was sponsored by a kiwi fruit association. However, there's probably not too many other people that would sponsor a month-long study on kiwi fruit. So basically what they found was that 2 kiwi fruit a day basically shortened the amount of time that it took to go from one end to the other again, that colon transit time, it really improved with the defecation as well as the other symptoms of the constipation linked to irritable bowel syndrome. And again, you might think, okay, well, is there something special about kiwi fruit that would make a difference in this particular condition? And as a matter of fact, yes, there is. This was one of those other mind-blowing presentations that I saw on nutritionfacts.org about serotonin and kiwi fruit. And again, it's another one of those things that makes you go, wait, what? Why on earth does a kiwi fruit have one of our brain hormones, serotonin, in it? I don't know why. Maybe the kiwi fruits are happy or sad, who knows? But one of those things that just a fluke of nature happens to be in there is serotonin. So when you eat the kiwi fruit and it goes into the gut, again, that's another mechanism by which those irritable nerves get calmed down a little bit, and so it improved with the symptoms. Now, I've got a colleague of mine who is a chiropractor who recommends a serotonin precursor for some of his patients called 5-HTP, and says that helps. I don't have as much experience in that field, and so, again, something else to investigate. So one of the final things that I want to talk about with irritable bowel is, when is irritable bowel not irritable bowel? Now, the idea is that those symptoms that I started off talking about are actually something that's indeed very, very, very common in the population. And so the idea is, if those symptoms are happening, chances are that there's a good chance that it would be that irritable bowel syndrome. However, if you're somebody who's over 50, and especially if you've been exposed to the Western diet and lifestyle, which includes a lot of foods that have a tendency to promote things like colon cancer, irritable bowel syndrome, as well as inflammatory bowel syndromes. That's the other way sometimes people will write IBS, meaning inflammatory bowel syndromes. Those are things like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and the like. And usually with something more serious like that, generally speaking, there might be maybe more blood, maybe more severe pain, and other similar symptoms. So we're going a little bit long in this presentation, so I'm not going to go into all the details about those things. But this is actually one of the reasons why, when people present to their physician with the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, by and large, many of them are referred to the GI doctor or gastrointestinal doctor. And as a matter of fact, this irritable bowel syndrome basically sometimes results in about half of all the referrals to the GI doctors. And that's because one of the things that we talk about with irritable bowel is it's kind of a disease of exclusion. So in other words, you say, all right, we go in there with a colonoscopy, basically a tube that goes up with kind of a flashlight to look around and see what's going on in there. And they will sometimes take a biopsy of the lining of the GI tract and basically send off to look under a microscope to see for sure that there's nothing wrong with it, that there's not a pathology that they can see, that it's not ulcerative colitis, that it's not the Crohn's disease, and that there's nothing funny as far as whether there's precancerous or cancerous lesions up in there. And so basically, once all the big, bad, and ugly, and scary things are rolled out, then you say, well, it's classic symptoms, bowel pain and gas that's relieved with defecation. So in other words, do a number 2 on the potty. And generally speaking, sometimes they'll use medications to help with symptoms and so forth. But the idea is that when something is a disease of exclusion, you want to make sure that the more serious conditions are ruled out before just assuming that something is irritable bowel. Alrighty, well, I hope you enjoyed this presentation tonight and have some practical tips for not only knowing a little bit more about the condition, but also some ideas of some kitchen remedies that you can start right away at home if desired. And as always, please do talk with your own primary care physician, because as mentioned, some of the other things that sometimes can happen in this arena, oftentimes it's not something we can tell just by looking at somebody or just taking a history. You need to sometimes take a little bit extra time and find out what else may be going on with it. Some other things that can be helpful with the gas and so forth, just as a general thing, is basically fennel seeds. So this is my last little tip for the presentation is if you ever get a chance to check out fennel seeds, they're in the grocery store in the spice rack, and there's these little tiny seeds that taste a little bit like licorice. And if you have some foods that you know are going to cause gas and bloating and other symptoms along with that, whether it's irritable bowel or and just because for some people certain foods like potatoes and cabbage and beans and other foods have a tendency to cause more gas than others, taking a few fennel seeds or making a fennel tea or something along those lines sometimes be helpful for relieving those symptoms. So, all right, so that was my last little tidbit to help you out with that. Alrighty, well, have a very good rest of your night. I don't see that there were any questions or anything asked during the presentation, so I'll just leave it at that. And if you have any questions, I might be able to answer them in a following up presentation. Take care. Bye-bye.